Larry Cohen. He's got a strange first name, but you can forgive him for that. He's also from my hometown of Philly, my homeboy. But he's a great champion for all workers. He's a great champion for democracy. As I'm sure you'll hear, he's a great champion of the power of collective bargaining and the need for it. Thank you very much for coming, Larry.
My pleasure. Thank you, Larry. Good job. So if you see me grimace, it's not just because of this chart.
You endowed it.
It's I'm battling some back pain here, so that's the reason for that. I actually do think this chart is really critical, and my comments in many ways are going to come back to it. In addition to everything we just heard, this is by far the worst chart in the world for any nation that calls itself a democracy. So today's the 25th anniversary of Tiananmen Square. Wages in China have risen significantly during that period. That doesn't mean that there's a trade-off for human rights. Absolutely not. And they've risen, not the way that we would want them to, not because working people have rights in China, more because of a state-controlled economy where they actually understand the demand curve of 80 years ago that we seem to have forgotten. Which is that when you don't have demand, you don't have supply. So many of the comments we just heard and why companies park their money in other countries, why they don't invest, why they buy back their own shares, why they increase their dividends, all of which is true, historic highs for all of those, is because they have learned on a micro level not to produce if there's no demand. And this is largely our demand curve for the last 40 years. Not exactly. It's a little higher than that. Immigration, despite its huge problems as practiced in the United States, the lack of equality for immigrants does create some demand. There are other things that create demand, but by and large, it's this. So we passed out, it's not labeled, but these three, they directly fit with what you heard, so I'm going to sort of cut down on what I would have said about them. Those charts are from activist trainings, not just stewards, but mobilizer training that we do in CWA. From this, anybody interested can download this. 50 million people building a movement for economic justice and democracy. So we would say if there's one thing you remember from my 10 minutes, it's not going to matter what our policy ideas are if we don't build a democracy movement in this country. I mean, it's not going to matter one bit. There's great people in this room. You mentioned Wilma, Dave Bonnier. They struggled as hard as I did, or we did, to build a working class movement in America on the inside. This is the aggregate results. This is also the aggregate results of, and this only matters to me and maybe my kids, but 40 years, union organizing, starting as a worker, 80 hours a week or more for 40 years. This is my watch as a key union leader in this country. We need to face up to this. And it's not just this. Let's take a look at the chart that I think Harold mentioned, the number 6.6, the first chart. 6.6 is not because working class people don't understand that without bargaining rights, forget about joining a union. It's about bargaining rights. Without bargaining rights, they can't raise wages. If you can't raise wages on a micro level, you're stuck with Piketty, frankly. And I say stuck deliberately. Because now you got a policy argument, and without a democracy movement, we have zero chance of moving forward on the policy agenda that we in this room could come up with. Larry laid a lot of it out, and his colleagues. It's in the paper. We got a great policy agenda. We have no power to enact it. It isn't just that working class people can't organize on the job. It's that this democracy is literally in the trash can. But we keep pretending as if it's not, that the next election is going to reinvent it. And yes, our union, others, we will be there because elections have consequences and there are differences between candidates. But we are also there, and we need to all be there to build a mass democracy movement in this country. Now, in the booklet, which we didn't pass out, 20 different bills that the woman we call the best speaker ever got through the Congress between 2009 and 2010 never got discussed for 1 second on the floor of the U.S. Senate. That's not what democracy looks like. Lots of good policy ideas, including 60% for the Employee Free Choice Act. And we have policy people, who, believe me, I argue with Oh, if you just hadn't gone for majority sign-up, or if you hadn't gone for first contract arbitration, well, then there would have been no reason to go for anything, let me just add. And they also forget that we have 80 years of corporations are people. Many of us in the democracy movement discovered that with Citizens United, that was a problem. That goes back to labor law in the early 1940s. Only in America can corporations run orchestrated campaigns to destroy the lives of working class people. They run them every day. A lot of my anger comes from being with those people, seeing those results. Companies like T-Mobile, controlled by the German company Deutsche Telekom, where one less than half the members of the board are elected and are Union Verdi members, and yet they sit back and say, we can't do anything about, we won't do anything about John Ledger, the pig who runs that company here, and he is a total pig, and I could go on beyond that about him. But let's just relate it to this last conversation. He made $28 million. He was given $28 million last year by Deutsche Telekom. The CEO in Germany made $3 million, who controls the company. This guy is a clown and buffoon. Hasn't had, and this is an industry we know really well. 2,000 call workers in this country are needed to aggregate the demand to equal his income last year. While he fires the workers, literally, the NLRB, to its credit, again, struggling to make some difference in a policy framework that's virtually impossible about what labor law is, almost unprecedented, has consolidated the cases at T-Mobile. The firings, the workers' rights, 35,000 workers in this country. They've consolidated only two companies, Walmart for the actions taken against strikers, and T-Mobile for the coast-to-coast suppression of workers' rights, including firings of leadership. That's just one example that we happen to be focused on. If we had the time, we could take from different organizations hundreds of examples like that. That's the micro level of what it means to be a worker in this country, if you're lucky enough, as you just heard, to be classified as a worker. That's another policy problem that for 5 years, Larry, this Labor Department, and they're the best bureaucrats we could have. And I mean that in the best sense, and I will say that, assuming Tom comes in and I get to introduce him, you couldn't have better people running this Labor Department. But the framework is rotten to the core. And we get sidetracked. We're going to nibble away at this. We're going to nibble away at that, and we should. But if we don't have the overall narrative of what's driving this, that you can't have a Senate function like this, so that even when we win the biggest political landslide in generations in 2008, we changed almost nothing here. Almost nothing. And we have to, some of us anyway, have to brag about the incremental steps on health care reform. And I don't want to get into that. But, and we would defend them as incremental steps, as opposed to the 400 items that passed the Pelosi Congress that never got discussed. 400 of them, including much better health care reform that everybody understands is much better health care reform, where when an employer doesn't provide health care, they pay a real penalty, not 2%, but 8%. That's 4 times higher. What we're seeing now is employers all over the lot abandon health care. Starts with retiree health care is virtually abandoned in the United States already. So it's not hopeless, as I say in our union. It's just the hardest it's ever been. Ever been. So this first slide, the 6.6, the cheery news, Larry, is that it was at 13.3. Now, just to get back to 13.3, that's 10 million workers with collective bargaining rights. But it was at 13.3 before the National Labor Relations Act was passed, and not because the act was passed, but because there was a mass movement for democracy that wasn't just workers organizing, it wasn't just political change, it wasn't just community organizing on an unprecedented level. It was these things combined with a common narrative. This is the lessons from there. And as I'll talk about in a minute, it's also the lessons from Brazil in the last 25 years. And with a more mixed record, South Africa in the last 20 years. So it can go up or down. And I talk here about collective bargaining because it's not about union membership. Yeah, that's what I spent a lifetime on. It's about collective bargaining rights. In France, membership is the same as the US, around 10 or 11%. But there's universal collective bargaining rights. And union membership takes on a different dimension there. somewhat because of works councils and other, very French or Southern European aspects. But when you have no collective bargaining rights, there's no ability to deal with the micro tendency. And we shouldn't skip it for a second. I've heard this lecture from CEOs of the top Fortune 10. They're not going to raise wages no matter how much money they make if they don't have to. And they're not going to keep jobs in America if they don't have to. The CEO of one of these companies said to me, it's like gravity. We're going to take the job to the lowest cost place we can produce it, unless there's policy to stop us. We're not going to have policy to stop it, whether it's trade policy or labor policy, unless we have a mass movement with a political dimension and take the money out of politics so we don't have the most expensive and worst elections in the world. $7 billion was the 2012 federal election. That's up 500% in 12 years. And that's not just Citizens United, and it's not just McCutcheon, although those are major factors. It's, at this point, totally deregulated spending and a Supreme Court that says if you can't show corruption, there's nothing wrong with the system. And that's a second leg of the democracy movement. And we heard about immigration rights. That's a third leg. We're 20 million people, not just the undocumented, 10 million with green cards and no real path to citizenship, on top of the 10 million undocumented. And then we have voting rights. So these are the four legs. The worst voting rights since the Voting Rights Act was passed. We now have no path to pass anything but a sort of symbolic Voting Rights Act. If you don't know that, it's a critical moment right now in this Congress. Republicans in the House will only agree to a stripped out Section 4 or Section 5. Section 4 provides the basis for Section 5. And these things may seem off topic, these democracy issues, when it comes to this, but they're not off topic. Because how do we change it? I don't care if you're Thomas Piketty, and I read that book before I go to bed. It's better than any sleeping pill for me. But the charts are really useful. And at that rate, I'll never finish it, so that's another story. But the charts are really useful. But we so often get confused between the policy that's in our head, why didn't somebody come up with this idea, and the democracy movement, we need to adopt it. The second chart here is the one that EPI and others have helped popularize, and it's critical, and it was alluded to. I'm not going to go into it. This productivity gap, but our little message that's in this book for every CWA activist and steward, the first thing they learn is that these two charts are directly related. The number one or two causal factor of the collapse of real wage gains, only in America, we'll get to that in a second, is the collapse of collective bargaining rights in the private sector. The charts are directly parallel, as you can see. Focus on the red lines in both, and then you see the productivity gap that was alluded to. The third chart, and I'm going to more or less end talking about this global economy. We hear global economy, global economy. Wage rates in the U.S. have a ceiling. They're fixed by the tradable sector and where those wage rates are elsewhere. It's blamed for the collapse of collective bargaining in part as well, particularly in the manufacturing sector. That's great, and some of those things there's some truth to. I could have 100 other countries here, and the U.S. would still be at the bottom. Now, this chart is wrong, George, as you know. It should say 10% where it says 0. 0 is the base. But the U.S. is just above 10%. About 12%, that's when you factor in the public sector. The 6.6 isn't wrong. Just the public sector is 35. So overall collective bargaining coverage in the U.S. is about 12, thereabouts. And the public sector is under attack as well. But what's the important part on this chart? It's not so much the comparison of collective bargaining rights in France to the U.S. or Germany, and lots of important lessons we could learn from Germany, where even Angela Merkel says, we don't need the same economic stimulus you need, President Obama. We have collective bargaining. It raises wages. It's sectorally based. We raise wages in Germany. And again, in the telecom sector, for example, this year they bargained sectorally. Wages went up 3% above inflation. In our collective bargaining, we're one of the strongest industries in terms of bargaining coverage. We have barely stayed even with inflation for this entire period. You have to factor in that we have to pay for health care, and in Germany they don't, but nonetheless. But as I mentioned, Brazil. So 25 years ago in Brazil, most of us in this room would either be, definitely me, either in prison or in exile. And the famous picture recently, and again, this connects back. Who led Brazil? What did they look like? Brazil, Argentina, and Chile 25 years ago. And that picture, there's a great picture of this. 3 guys saluting in military uniforms. Those were the leaders. And who are the leaders today? 3 women. Similar picture of them. Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Southern Cone. 3 women, all of whom are socialists. Brazil, Dilma, who was imprisoned, and who succeeded Lula, who himself was a union leader, a machinist in the metal workers, and helped build the Workers' Party from nothing. And I'm not talking here about, well, we have to just build another party and that'll do it. It's not that. It's that they built a political movement with democracy elements in it to say to the oligarchy, which we now have ourselves, to say to that oligarchy, we've had enough. And even with all the obstacles, we're going to fight our way through that in a peaceful way. Now, they didn't have campaign financing problems, the voting rights problems. They did have some voting rights problems. South Africa, we all know the story of 20 years ago ending apartheid. Well, let me just say the key on Brazil is actually this one's a little low. Over 40% of workers in Brazil have collective bargaining coverage. This issue of the informal sector, that's the generic term for misclassification, has gone down some. It's still a huge issue in Brazil. And wages go up. I'll give you one example. The finance sector is organized. They have sectoral bargaining. Finance sector wages in Brazil are now higher than in the U.S. In fact, the Brazil bank workers came to us and said, we're really troubled. We're raising wages at Bank of New York. We're raising wages at Bank of America. We're raising wages at Chase. And what are you doing? And they literally said, we're going to give you a grant. Now, that grant doesn't begin to attack 6 million financial workers in the U.S. with no rights. And they did. Hundreds of thousands of dollars they've poured into community groups to help us form, similar to fast food, sort of big community organizing approach to financial workers in 5 key U.S. cities. But again, so there's 2 sides to that, right? What do we do in a global economy? We unite and fight. But the other point is, those bank workers in Brazil have a higher standard of living than back office bank workers in New York, let alone the other 4 cities, Cleveland, St. Louis, Minneapolis, and San Francisco. So 45% in Brazil, it's gone up from maybe 5 to 45. South Africa had 10% collective bargaining before apartheid was smashed. Now it's about 40%. Don't go, and this is too often conventional wisdom you'll get back. They don't go necessarily down. They go up or down based on what kind of a movement we build. And so, finally, the other aspect of this global economy is, and again, it was mentioned already, is trade. We don't have trade policy in this country. We have foreign policy that substitutes for trade policy. It's a critical problem. We're not against trade. We want 21st century trade, and we're building alliances because of TPP. That's the only good thing about it. And TTIP, which is Trans-Pacific Partnership and Transatlantic Trade and Investment Policy, the big trade deal with the EU, is pushing us to build partnerships not just with labor, the partnerships among green and consumer and labor on a global basis to define what should 21st century trade be. But early on in the Obama years, I had my own, sort of private meetings with key White House economists, and they said, okay, we're going to actually produce a paper to show why this is the reality in America. Will you be disappointed, Larry, if collective bargaining is only number 2 or number 3, because you have the informal sector growth and you have globalization? Well, they've yet to produce that paper, sadly. But what does globalization mean as a leading cause? It means that at least 25% of our jobs in this country, including call center jobs, where we have 100,000 people. Hi, Tom. I'm going to get to your introduction in 1 second. 25% of our jobs are tradable. And that means that, for example, when we bargain with an AT&T for internet jobs that we actually brought back from the Philippines, they say at the bargaining table, and this is why the micro doesn't work, we can raise wage rates, but the jobs will go back to the Philippines. That's the reality for 25% of American workers, either directly or indirectly. So this wage stagnation, in real dollar terms, what are the major factors that explain it? Number 1 is our approach to globalization that we call trade policy. It's not trade policy, it's investment policy. As Larry said so well, the growth of the finance sector to 16% of GDP, unprecedented. In every other nation, it's around 5 or 6. The clout they have in any White House, they've had it in terms of trade policy. It's Clinton, Bush, Obama, virtually the same degree of authority they have. It comes back to campaign finance issues and the huge amounts of money they have to contribute. But we have investment policy. We don't have trade policy. Trade policy for every one of the other nations that you see here that Tom referenced in his recent talk in San Francisco, and I'm going to come back to that. I should be calling you secretary at this point, especially since you're in the room, and because I love you. So in his recent talk in San Francisco, there's so many of these ways, starting with collective bargaining rights, where we are so far behind the rest of the world. And yet what we end up doing, each one of us, whether we work in the best labor department ever, or in any labor union, or in great NGOs that are in this room, we end up, and it's understandable, we work on what we can to make a difference. And if we didn't do this, we would be irresponsible. But if we also don't look at what are these other factors, why is it that Greens and labor and consumers are going to go at this trade policy as if our life depended on it? Because it does. It's not just the tradable jobs. It's the effect that the lack of a trade policy, coupled with no macro labor policy, collective bargaining rights, has on wages that directly suppresses 25% of wages in America and indirectly the other 75%, because when you take out the demand factor of the 25%, it bleeds into all of the rest. And so when we move forward because of the democracy problems, Senate rules, money in politics, no rights for 20 million immigrants, including green card holders, and voting rights suppression, that holds back all the legislation that would have bubbled up from that Pelosi-led Congress, including Employee Free Choice Act, the DREAM Act, much bigger economic stimulus, a much better health care bill. The list is on and on and on, disclosed so we at least know where that money came from. We have to say to ourselves, we can't just do that micro work that we must do, that some folks in this room, including this Labor Department, have done in the best imaginable way. We also have to go out and build this 50 million. Why do I say 50 million? That's roughly half of who votes in a typical election. So at least on voting, a narrative that shields us all, what we call a common narrative from the 99% spring training that we did with all kinds of other groups 2 years ago. Common narrative, not just coalition on a transaction. A common narrative about the demand side that produces this mess that we all should go home remembering, that line. Government after government not addressing it because in many ways they can't, whether it's the Senate rules or the voting rights or the money in politics, which just gets worse, or the suppression of the rights for 20 million immigrants. And so, I'm now going to shift from that. So remember, it's the common narrative, building a movement of 50 million, linking the democracy issues to these macroeconomic issues, at the same time doing the best sort of micro work we can do. And as I already mentioned, Secretary, I read your, and printed out, your comments just days ago, last week, in San Francisco, White House Summit on Working Families. And since you're now here and everybody wants to hear from you, I could give a long introduction about you. No, but you say that no matter what. But I do have to say, before I get to this, that you, your whole life has been on our side, and I couldn't be more thankful, and that's a huge blessing for all of us. Your friend George Cole, sitting over there, worked in your first election, lives in your neighborhood, and works with me. And since that first election, Montgomery County Council, your role as whatever they call the Secretary of Labor in Maryland, your work, incredible work on voter suppression in the Justice Department, and every one of the, actually I know almost exactly how many days you've been Labor Secretary because of the fight we had on the Senate rules to get you confirmed. Since August 1st of last year as Labor Secretary, you've been absolutely tireless. And MB, who's sitting next to you, an amazing friend of ours. I also want to say, if you look at who this secretary has named to these key jobs, you couldn't find better people and we couldn't get better people. So again, I just want to underscore this. This is the best we can be unless we can find a path to attack these macro issues that this Labor Department cheers on every day. So in this speech, which I recommend to folks, just last week, the Secretary ties it all together. Starts out with the minimum wage and then clearly says that's not enough. And Secretary, that's what we've been talking about all day, that the narrative that just talks about the minimum wage, number one, politically it's dangerous because the 85% of working class people who are above the minimum wage, even above $10 or even $15, think, hey, my life is really, really hard. Who's speaking for me? And where do we find at least the narrative that speaks for me, even if we can't get the policy? But in this speech, you have the narrative because he goes on to talk about overtime, talks about global comparisons, and talks about the role of the labor movement. Says specifically in his speech, no one else in this government is saying this, raising the minimum wage is a good start, but we also must protect and strengthen collective bargaining rights, the opportunity to negotiate for your fair share. I have this stapled, so I'm missing a word.